don't want a ladder in the background.
We need to bring the little on-air sign that Rob got you.
Oh, I was going to bring it. I forgot.
Yeah.
Okay. Well.
All right, let's get this rolling.
Yeah, I know. I'm just trying to mirror you on the video. I think we're good. Our heads are at the same,
yes,
level.
I have a small head, though, and you have a large beard.
You're gonna make fun. I think you were gonna make fun of me for my fueling choices.
Yeah, but aren't you gonna introduce the episode?
Welcome to episode 7. Welcome to episode 7 of Legwork. Today it is all about nutrition, not just for race day, but for training.
And also for race day.
And to prevent injuries, right? There's lots of reasons why we want to make sure that we have good nutrition.
Yeah, and enhance recovery.
Yeah, for sure. But I think either it gets super detailed or it's so personal to you. And the super detailed part is hard to wade through. Yeah. And then it's super personal to you, just got to try everything, means that it's hard to start.
Yeah.
And I think it can be like getting into a gym, and similar to a strength routine, you can get it super nerdy on exactly how many reps, and it can feel very daunting, or it can be, well, you should just do things that make sense to you. And then that still doesn't leave people with a lot of like, how do I actually do this in practice?
Or you can look around and do what someone else is doing.
Right. And obviously what's right for them isn't what's right for you. And so we thought it was important to have an episode about how to navigate in a thoughtful way race fuel options. So to be clear, we are not nutritionists. This episode is not giving you nutritional advice as such, but we are trying to help navigate the range of options that are out there and why they may or may not work for a given person based on what is known about the science. And Molly, you've read countless pages at this point in preparation for today. And we want to ensure that people can walk away from this understanding a bit better of, well, this didn't work for me. Hopefully this episode helps you understand why and what a potential alternative could be. So we're going to take the nutritional landscape and try and help break that down into buckets of how nutrition products are structured and formulated, and therefore how they might affect or impact your body, or ways in which you need to take that nutrition along with, say, water to hopefully help aid in performance.
Yep. So in the time that I've known you, you've had several fueling eras.
This is true.
And some mishaps and some learning experiences along the way. So I think your experience is probably actually pretty similar to a lot of people. So maybe walk us through what you tried and maybe moved away from or learned in the process.
My relationship with and experience with nutrition, both for training and racing, has been a challenge. I started out with, I think, like what everybody has, goos or nothing.
Yeah.
And I think it's fair to say that I probably ran a lot of runs fasted, which was probably not good. And because nutrition was not a limiting factor for me in the beginning, certainly as I was doing training and getting better,
or if it was, you didn't know.
Yeah. And sorry, that's what I mean, is that it did not appear outwardly as this limiting factor. I did not exhaust training modalities and recovery to such an extent where it's like, maybe I need to start thinking about how do I fuel this, right?
Yeah.
I didn't really have too many bonks per se.
Right.
In a way where it's like, oh, you should fuel better. So after the goo sort of experience, which is the initial bit, and I really did not like goo.
Yeah. I think a lot of people, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about that when we get into specific fuels, but I think that's often when that is the first product someone is introduced to, either it doesn't sit well or they just don't like it. I think especially the early days of goo where there were limited flavors, people got turned off to it.
Although I'm pretty sure birthday cake was available at the time.
It was not when I started running.
I just didn't like the consistency of goo. I thought it was too thick. And flavors that I thought I would like, such as, chocolate peanut butter, or like something like fudge or whatever. They became too thick. And so it kind of turned me off of using them. And whenever I did use them, it was almost always in a race capacity. It was not in a training capacity. So over time, I think it became very clear that I needed to start thinking about nutrition as a positive means of performance and not solely as, I don't know, this thing that I probably should do. It wasn't top of mind when I was chipping away minutes at a time early into training.
Right.
So fast forward to, I've tried almost everything from Science and Sport, Morton, Huma's.
Let's not forget your real food
Precision
experiments.
Yes, I had real food experiments when I was transitioning into being a vegetarian, and when I was seeing a nutritionist, Tara Mardigan, who's here in New York, the plate coach for those who would like to speak with her. And I talked about this transition for me from being a meat eater into much more vegetarian, sometimes pescatarian. And I wanted to make sure that I was getting the right things. And we talked about my nutrition for running as well. And I dabbled in some interesting forays into sort of, quote, natural forms of fueling, such as 100% pure Vermont maple syrup and taking a shot of maple syrup before runs, heating it up in the microwave because I just loved that. And it actually ruined maple syrup for me for a while. Yeah. And then I also tried honey. At one point I put honey into a sandwich bag and rolled it up, put it into my shorts pocket. And then a few miles later, pulled it out and was trying to like squeeze out this honey into I didn't have a beard then, so it was a little bit easier, but, trying to squeeze out this honey. And so I have really tried everything from DIY to bicarb system, a multi-part system for more time.
That is nutrition, but
sure. But I think something being consumed. And I'm just kind of saying that like my experience has ranged from the DIY to a multi-part, very high tech type of thing. And so now I have a couple of different things in the mix, but for the bottom line for me is that nutrition started out as this thing that I really didn't know anything about, and early on didn't matter as much. And for maybe some of the people listening, that might resonate as a message, because it isn't something that, particularly if you're chipping away at your time, that it is the thing that you're focused mostly on, especially if you're really doing 5Ks and 10Ks. When we get to marathons, obviously, and even half marathons, nutrition really becomes important. And
also for training.
Yeah. And I'm sure it'll come up at some point, but I had a stress fracture, a sacral stress fracture, and the sort of post-mortem diagnosis of that is that I essentially had a lack of energy availability, which means that I wasn't eating enough to fuel my training. And so hopefully this episode will encourage people to think of nutrition not solely as a in-race thing, but a training thing and an injury prevention mechanism. And while, again, just as disclaimer, we're not nutritionists, this isn't nutritional advice.
We're not going to talk about dietary nutrition more broadly.
Correct.
This is confined to workouts and race day and carb loading and recovery.
And so to kind of step through this methodically, we're going to have a brief history of fueling. We'll talk about energy systems and how we would match fuels to those energy systems, understanding how our body works at a general level. We think it's helpful to have a bit of a foundation as we're trying to understand why might this nutritional product work for you or not. We'll then talk about the actual act of fueling, what, when, and how much. We'll then talk about in-run fueling, whether that's during training or on race day.
Common issues, and I think maybe hopefully how to troubleshoot or at least think about what could be going wrong, because I think that's a little more nuanced often than people assume. Right.
And of course, with all of this, it translates into, for many, particularly towards the end of your training cycle, what does all of this mean in terms of carb loading, in addition to the sort of in race? So let's kick it off. I see the first note here is about ancient times.
Yes.
So I'm very interested to understand what they did in ancient times. Are we going to talk about the Romans?
Yeah, I think it applies to the Romans.
Okay.
It's kind of an ancient warrior thing. And I think this would be actually the first conception of something nutritional or consumed that could affect performance. And that was the practice of eating entrails or, parts of animals that were believed to then confer some aspect of, bravery or strength. So there was sort of, probably a slightly mystical practice.
I did not know that.
Yeah, I thought it was a fun
It is a
intro.
fun fact. Yeah.
And I think it's actually kind of interesting in that protein and animal sources were assumed to be the preferential fuel source for exercise in general, kind of until the 40s. And I do wonder if that comes a little bit from this, like, meat eating strength connection. So in the 20s, actually, we kind of started to get the first understanding scientifically of how energy is actually produced within muscles. So I think it was like 1925 was like the A.V. Hill research with the frog leg. So that was kind of the era.
Yeah. Your basic science class, starting out understanding things.
So in the 20s, Harvard Medical School started doing a series of experiments every year at the finish line of the Boston Marathon. And they were doing blood testing and found that higher levels of blood glucose at the finish line correlated with, quote, less fatigue, stupor, and inability to concentrate.
Can I ask a question? What
Sure.
exactly is stupor?
I mean, I certainly have been at the finish line of the Boston Marathon in a stupor.
In a stupor. Okay.
I think that's the sciencey way of saying you're just kind of out of it. We've all been there.
Got it.
So yeah, in the 20s.
Was this the first known real set of experiments in a athletic context?
Probably was. I mean, when you think about like the Hill experiments in the 20s and this at the Boston Marathon, it did seem to kind of be, and this was also would have been like post World War I, and there was a lot more attention at that point to fitness, I think, and also following like the flu epidemic. Mm-hmm. Of the same era, there was historically kind of the first focus, I think, on fitness as a concept outside of, just sort of how strong you might be from work or something. It was kind of recognized that maybe this, with modern conveniences, post-industrial revolution, this is something we need to actually think about.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was the 20s. So they were starting to identify that blood glucose was important for endurance activity, but protein still kind of prevailed. And I think a little bit of that was like sort of the bodybuilding era also, because they knew that clearly protein intake was connected to muscle growth and strength. And so it was kind of still assumed that that would be helpful for endurance activity as well. But it was the mid 40s when they started to do some research that showed that protein had really no effect on endurance performance. So then there was a shift to starting to think about carbohydrates as a fuel source. It still took until the 60s.
So let me understand. So in the 1920s, so how did we shift from 1920s, where it was recognized as a primary fuel source, to protein and then back again?
I think my sense, I was curious as well. My sense is that it was sort of an academic area of research, but it wasn't really thought about as like a practical. The connection had not been made to dietary carbohydrate affecting performance. They just had identified that the lower your blood sugar, essentially at the end of the race, the worse shape you were probably in.
Well, and of course, this is also during the time of World War I and II. And I believe things like, effectively Snickers and other chocolate bars were used, and they, had peanuts in there as like a mix of fats, proteins, and sugars for soldiers on the front to as an energy bar effectively. So I know that there was some research out of the military to figure out how to feed your army. I'm just curious if any of the early, as is often the case, I'm just curious if any of some of the studies at the time were effectively military-based studies.
I'm sure they were. And also this was kind of still the like amateurism view of athletics. Like if we think of like Bannister breaking the 4-minute mile, it was sort of the attitude still largely was that the winner of these things should be the most talented and not the person that trained the hardest. So it was almost as though like training science was seen, I think, a little bit as like a cheat.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
Like we were still sort of in the like gentleman athletics era.
Right.
So I think there was probably just less attention to, maybe from a physiological standpoint, we were figuring out the science of how energy is created, but we weren't probably implementing that for performance.
Well, because I think Bannister, this is a slight diversion here, but I think Bannister did workouts in a way that hadn't really been done.
Interval
and that
training started around the 20s, I think, with Gershler. So because we had like a pre-war era, probably if World War II hadn't happened, we would have had a 4-minute mile in the 30s, which is an aside. But yeah, I mean, there was some thought to training structure in the 20s. But I think, again, like you had the war interrupting everything, and then you didn't really get back to, like Bannister actually undertaking structured training was kind of a big deal.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think the whole attitude towards sports and performance was changing in that era. When you get to the 60s, there was started to be a lot more science showing that the role of muscle glycogen in causing fatigue as it is depleted started to come to the forefront. And then in 65, you had Gatorade being developed at the University of Florida, which was mainly a reaction to athletes becoming dangerously dehydrated in workouts in Florida. And so their nutrition department developed Gatorade, which was a mix of carbohydrates and electrolytes, because they were finding that their athletes were depleted in both when they would end up in bad shape. So that was really the first sports nutrition product. And it became commercially available in 1967. It still took until 1976 at the Montreal Olympics, where the use of carbs as a performance enhancer was really widely adopted, and coaches and athletes were kind of undertaking it commonly. And then in the 80s, 70s and 80s, you start to get carb loading becoming a term, and you're kind of hitting the running boom at that point. So 1980s, you had the first studies on ingesting carbs during exercise, and that showing enhanced performance. And one fun thing I came across in doing my research was you had carb loading introduced in the late 70s. And then in the 80s, the trend was called carb loafing. And it was the theory that you just maintained your normal carbohydrate intake and you just hard tapered and loafed, and that would carb load you. So you didn't have to consume extra carbohydrates, but you ate normally and loafed. Carb loafing.
Carb loafing.
Yes.
We don't use that term these days.
No, we don't. I suspect it was not optimal.
Probably not. Do you think they got like in little loaves like a cat?
Maybe.
And this is where they just sat around?
Yeah. You tapered without, you did no workouts was the idea.
Mm. Do you think we should bring back the term?
Carb loafing?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a great term.
It is a great term. Maybe we should reintroduce it.
Hashtag carb loafing.
Carb loafing.
But yeah, so that was the 80s. And then we didn't really hit kind of the modern era of sports science until early 2000s. And that's when you start really getting science-driven formulations that were engineered to enhance absorption and reduce GI distress and be performance enhancing within a workout. And that's kind of still where we are. I would say we're still in the same era of nutrition as what we were starting to develop in the early aughts. And there's been obviously fads within that. I mean, ironically, we probably came back to protein and fat in the low carb keto era that has kind of popped up again. And that's something we'll talk about briefly. But we haven't really progressed a ton in 20 years, but there's still way more products out there. So that's kind of what we're here to discuss. But I think before we get to products, let's talk about energy systems. And this also pertains to how it works if you choose to keto, fuel, or become fat adapted. So we have three fuel systems primarily that we use to create energy. There's fats, carbs, and phosphocreatine. And fats and carbs can be stored for future use. Carbs are somewhat limited in their storage capacity. Fat, we have a lot more of, and it also produces more energy when you burn it. And then phosphocreatine is synthesized when you need it. So that's why at the gym, when you do a set, you kind of need to wait a minute or two before you start the next set, because that's that kind of explosive energy that you're using. And it takes a minute for it to replenish. Primarily here, we're going to be concerned with fat and glycogen, since those are, for any event over 10 seconds long, going to be irrelevant fuel sources. Fat is the slowest pathway. The reaction series that it takes, fat's a huge molecule. And the energy in any of these systems is released as you're breaking bonds between atoms within the molecule. A big molecule stores a lot of energy, but it also takes a lot to break it down. So there's a lot of steps in oxidizing fat, and it also creates a lot of energy. It takes a lot of oxygen to run those reactions. So from a practical standpoint, when you kind of hear like fat burning zone, I'm using air quotes here, what that really means is you're running at a low enough intensity that you can supply enough oxygen to sustain this slow reaction. It's going to produce a lot of energy, but it's going to produce it at a rate that is going to be limited in kind of how much energy your muscles can demand. As you increase intensity, more and more of your energy is going to be coming from carbohydrate sources. So that is the stored glycogen, which is a stored carbohydrate molecule that gets stored either in your liver or within muscle fiber. Generally, people can store, if you're fully carb loaded, you can store 90 minutes to 2 hours worth of energy in the form of glycogen. And depending on how well trained you are, your body will be able to utilize more of those stores kind of before your brain shuts it off and says we're too low. So that's part of what training does, is allow you to kind of access those energy stores. So glycogen, when it's oxidized, is a faster reaction than fat, but also releases less energy, and it still requires oxygen to oxidize it. So that's your middle speed in terms of energy production. And then when you need really a fast pathway, you can just ferment carbohydrates, glycogen, into a much smaller amount of energy, but it's 100 times faster. So depending on kind of what you're optimizing for, that is a way better deal if you need energy quickly than trying to oxidize it to get more energy out of it, but it taking 100 times longer.
So that begs the question then of why do you not just always use the thing that's 100 times faster? And that's because the stored form of sugar, glycogen, is, for all intents and purposes, finite.
Yeah.
But for your continuing to replenish it via nutrition, fat, you have this theoretically infinite supply of, but it is much slower of a process. And phosphocreatine is really not in the discussion outside of 100 meters.
Yeah. So if we think of it as kind of a sliding scale, depending on level of intensity, you're always going to be using some amount of fat and some amount of glycogen. Where you are on that scale, one tipped one way or the other, depends on how hard you're running. And the tipping point is essentially 60% of VO2 max.
So once you go faster than 60% of VO2 max, the body starts preferring glycogen.
Correct. And I mean, it's 60 to 70.
And to be clear, when we talk about glycogen, because we want to make sure that we're talking in a manner that doesn't turn people off and you guys think this is just a science lesson. But glycogen is the stored form of any sugar that you consume.
Yeah. So intensity is below 60% VO2 max. Fat is going to be the dominant energy source. So this is conversational pace. You are easily able to provide the oxygen needed to produce energy. So this is like when your breathing is not labored, essentially. And fat is kind of an unlimited resource. Whereas with glycogen, once you're above 75% of VO2 max, you are definitely fully into carbohydrate as your main fuel source. You're still getting some from fat, but the dominant source is going to be sugar. So for context, marathon pace is for most people somewhere between 75 and 85% of VO2 max. So if you think about it, marathon pace kind of does, I think, even from a feel standpoint, it's a tick. You're definitely outside of easy pace.
For sure.
It's sustainable, but you're working. And that's kind of the tipping point where even for a marathon, your dominant fuel source is going to be sugar and not fat.
Right.
Which is why, for races, a half marathon is a faster pace than a full, obviously, even though it's a shorter distance. You really do need to be thinking about supplementing carbs because that's the primary fuel you're running on.
Unfortunately, and some of this is social pressure, some of this is pace envy or pace ego or whatever, that they're probably getting close to 75% VO2 max even for like an easy run.
Sure.
And I think that's worth keeping in mind that when we're training and you think you're just going out for an easy run, that if you're not fueling even your easy runs, particularly given how long they might be, and as you just said, there's about 90 minutes worth of carbohydrates in your body, right? We hear that stat a lot. And so that's going to run out at some point. And so for many people who are doing like maybe not the shortest run of the week, but many of the runs are probably going to get to that point where you're getting depleted.
Yeah.
It's worth making sure that you're not going into that fasted.
Right.
Like, especially if you're a night runner, or well, even if you're a morning runner and you've
liver glycogen depletes overnight. Stored glycogen in your muscles doesn't, but that's the other thing is if you're waking, even if you ate a good dinner and carb loaded a little bit the night before your long run, you're still going to wake up having burned off some of that in your sleep. So I think just having some kind of carby breakfast, even if it's light, is going to help replenish what you lost overnight.
Yeah. Or like me, you have a shot of maple syrup.
Warm maple syrup.
Warm maple syrup. There's nothing better.
But the other point to keep in mind with muscle glycogen is it's stored in the muscles, which is great because it's right there when your muscle needs it. However, glycogen molecules are still pretty large. They're too big to move between muscle fibers. So once it's depleted in a muscle, it's gone. So the 90 minutes or 2 hours that's in your body, some of it's in your arms, some of it's in locations that aren't going to be the heavily taxed ones in a race. So once it's depleted in your legs, you can't just move.
Right. It's not fungible.
Yeah. So what's in your liver can be released into your bloodstream, and that can go to depleted muscles until it's gone. And, eventually we'll do an episode on lactate and how that moves around and can help depleted muscles. But for the most part.
Yeah, I guess that's almost like the fourth system. You talk about fats and carbs, but lactate could probably be thrown in there.
It's kind of the go-between between the fast system and the slow system. That's the beauty of it.
Okay, so liver glycogen can be released into the bloodstream.
Correct.
Muscle glycogen cannot
it's stuck
be.
Where it is.
And why is that the case?
It's a big molecule and you can't just move it around easily. The liver has the capacity to release it into the bloodstream, whereas a muscle fiber doesn't have the capacity to push it out through the membrane to a different membrane.
Interesting. Right. But
it can
as you
only
said,
move as what it can push out is lactate.
Right.
Which is how it then moves energy around.
But as you said, liver glycogen depletes overnight.
Correct. And not all of it, but certainly in a race too, it's, that is also contributing to your fueling.
Got it. Okay, so we know that carbs are preferred, especially if you are running faster than you should be. When you are at a slower pace and fat is something that your body is fine with using, what's happening then?
So we're using that slower pathway, which is requiring more oxygen. So in that case, and especially if you're just doing a long run that's at an easy pace, we are actually training all of the mechanisms that help fat burning occur. That also involves transporter molecules that move fats across membranes and training at that pace and creating a demand to be able to use fat as a fuel will increase those transporters. So if I want more energy and I want it from fat, the only option I have is to create more factories essentially to process that fat. So that is in fact what happens when you're doing a lot of easy pace running, is your body then says, like, we're using fat a lot, maybe we should create more mitochondria since that's what I use to process fat, and then I can have more energy available kind of through parallel paths rather, because I can't make it faster. So that, again, that's kind of an endorsement for why running easy pace at actual easy pace is beneficial. That doesn't mean that you should run those runs fasted. Again, remember, we're always going to be using some balance of fat and glycogen, even at a slow pace. It's less than half, but it's still used. And also completely depleting the glycogen in your legs, which might happen over a 2 or 3 hour long run, even at an easy pace, is going to delay recovery. It's going to make it harder to do your next workout.
Yeah.
So
I think there's a point there that I want to emphasize, which is, I think there's this, and I succumb to this as well, particularly when you're running with a group. It is far easier, I think, to be pushed in I'm going to run faster than slower.
Yeah.
And the biggest detriment, perhaps, is that then you're losing valuable opportunities to build the additional factories, right? And there was a recent tweet by Magnus that was talking about people focusing on mitochondria, and it bugs the hell out of me that MAGA movement now talks so much about mitochondrial dysfunction, and it makes it then seem like if you ever want to talk about mitochondria that you are, perhaps, I don't know, ill-informed about something. Maybe that's unfair in some cases, but I think in this particular case, mitochondria is important. And I, at least in my training, try to ensure that when I'm doing easy paces, that there's a range of easy paces. There are some easy runs that I'm doing at a 9:30. There are some that I'm doing at 8, and there are some where I'm at closer to 7. So I think it's okay to have ones that are on the faster end. There's certainly a purpose to those, but I think that never doing it on a slower pace for whatever potential ego reasons, it's actually just bad, just run training.
Yeah, you're missing out on training a whole energy system.
Yeah. I think that's really the point to emphasize, is that there's a whole energy system that will only be trained by running slower. And I think that some people might see that as like a weakness, or like you hear to run faster, you need to run faster, which is true to an extent when you're talking about your workouts. Do you see differences in anything that you've talked about across type of athletes, gender? What are some of the differences, if any, in the literature, depending on where you are in your running career? Again, trained, less trained, enthusiast, as some of the studies call it, or gender or age. Is there anything that makes a difference?
So women definitely use fat as a fuel a little more efficiently. Our crossover point is slightly higher as a percentage of VO2 max.
Right, which means that for a faster relative pace, you're still using more fat than glycogen.
We can rely on fat a little bit longer, which may just be because we tend to have higher body fat percentages in general. So it is a more sustaining fuel source.
I'm curious if that also contributes to why.
I think it's why we're better ultra runners.
Why you're,
I mean, we're not better, but
well,
we are.
I think another way to say that would be, I think that's, you do hear often that women are better at pacing and tend to be better at fueling.
That may not have anything to do with.
Sure, there might be a number of reasons, but it does stand to reason that if you are generally speaking able to rely more on fat and less on glycogen, then that's going to stave off.
Yeah, we might bonk a little later. It might be, it might make things like ultras come slightly more naturally. So that is definitely a difference. Obviously, part of what training develops is the capacity to better and more efficiently use fat as a fuel source. So when you're less trained, you might actually be crossing over to glycogen at 50% VO2 max rather than 60. So that, again, as you kind of build more factories, assuming you're running truly easy pace, that comes with training. And then I think the other big one that would affect this is if you are more of a fast twitch athlete versus slow twitch. So not to get too deep into muscle fiber weeds, but slow twitch fiber is more rich in mitochondria. Fast twitch fiber can have some, and it's kind of a gradient. It's not like every fiber falls in one camp or the other. But the more fast twitch you are, the harder you're going to have to work at probably slower paced runs to develop those mitochondria in faster twitch fiber, because some fast twitch fiber cannot harbor mitochondria at all, and is completely then reliant on fermenting glycogen, because that happens outside of mitochondria. So the more fast twitch you are, probably the more reliant you're going to be on glycogen, even if you're well trained.
Yeah.
If you know that about yourself, you may need to just kind of be at the higher end of the fueling rates that we're going to talk about later, just because you're going to be burning through it more quickly than somebody that's like, 85% slow twitch.
So I think a lot of the rest of our agenda today is going to be focused on carbs.
Yeah.
So before we move away, can you really be fat adapted?
You can. And all the things that we just talked about, improving where your crossover point is, those are all trainable. It is trainable to a point, and then you're kind of going to reach a point of diminishing returns. So because, as we talked about, fat's a big molecule, it takes a long time, relatively speaking, to break it down and produce energy. There's always going to be a ceiling on how fast your 60 to 75% of VO2 max pace is. So if you are not going to provide carbs and you're going to be reliant on fat, you're really just putting a cap on it's a speed limit. So arguably, maybe if you're running an ultra and you are somebody that just has terrible GI issues trying to fuel, like maybe that's a strategy that makes sense. But even when you're talking about a marathon pace can be well into the glycogen reliant zone. So I would think hard, and there's a lot of other implications to not providing glycogen when you're training, and what your body thinks is going on, and kind of running fasted or running only with fat as fuel that can have other knock-on effects that are worth considering. And I think in almost all cases really outweigh any benefit you're going to get.
Yeah. Yeah, because the second you go to marathon pace, which is going to be among the slowest of one's training, if even that is already you're in the glycogen area and you're at that like 75+% of your VO2 max, it's that carbs are going to be critical for that race.
Right. And I think the other thing that's worth mentioning here is I've heard, sadly, frequently, I think runners on the slower end of the spectrum being told, because their pace is slower, that they are in a fat burning zone, as though that is not relative to their effort. And, whether you're running a 5-hour marathon or a 3-hour marathon, you are running your marathon pace.
Yeah.
So to say that somebody is not burning sugar because it takes them longer does not mean that they're not working just as hard as somebody that's, pacing more quickly.
Yeah. And my own research for this as well that came out in one of the summary studies that this spans across from at least on a relative basis to other populations.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the other thing is, the capping your long run at 3 hours rule, in the argument that's often given is that, you can't recover from that quickly. I think, again, a lot of that is, if it's taking you 4 hours to do your long run, are you properly fueling that 4-hour long run? And I think a lot of times people are either not knowing how to do that or being told they don't need to.
Yeah. So I think that perhaps then is a good segue from, like, we've talked about now the general fuels of glycogen and fat and roughly when they start becoming utilized. Let's transition into what all of this means into performance, because I suspect that's what everybody listening is trying to get to. Is we know that carbs are important. I know that I have to replenish them, but I'd like to understand maybe a little bit more of the pathways. So I think let's move on to what happens when you fuel with carbs. What's actually happening?
So the first thing when you taste it is, assuming there's real sugar in it and not artificial sweeteners, your brain gets the message that fuel is coming.
Woohoo!
Yeah, exactly. So, like the fuel gauge on your car, when the light comes on before it's actually empty, your brain kind of puts the brakes on when it knows fuel is depleting.
Yeah, it's protecting you.
Yeah, so it's protecting you. The little fuel light has come on, and the minute it hits your mouth and you taste it, your brain gets a signal to say, it's okay, turn the light off. So that can actually help in the short term, even if you were to spit it out. And I think a lot of us have heard that, research, that if you kind of slosh Gatorade around and spit it out, it will still help. And that's a short-term thing. It's not like a marathon strategy, but if it's at the end of your race and you really just can't do it anymore, that will help you access a little bit more of the reserves you still have.
Yeah.
So it kind of starts with the brain. The fuel itself goes to your stomach, assuming we're talking about sports fuel, which is a simple sugar. It's not like you're eating whole grain bread that needs to be broken down from complex carbohydrates into simple ones. So it gets to your stomach. Not much needs to happen there because it's already in a pretty simple form. From there, it's going to go to your small intestine, and that's kind of where all of the magic happens. So in the small intestine, polysaccharides, which is just a larger sugar molecule, are broken down into monosaccharides, and those can be glucose, galactose, which you don't really see in fuel products, or fructose. Once they are in that form, they can be transported across cell membranes of the lining of the small intestine, and they're going to actually then start to be utilized in the bloodstream. They're either going to go to your liver or they're going to go straight to muscles. The limiter here, interestingly, is that movement across the membrane. So this is where we're really going to get into it when we start to talk about specific fuels and how they're formulated. But most race fuels are going to be fructose or glucose or some combination. And when I mentioned the modern era of fueling science, what that is starting to use two fuel sources simultaneously, and it's typically glucose and fructose. The reason for that is each sugar type needs its own transporter molecule that's going to bind to it and allow it to cross the membrane of the small intestine. Fructose is transported by the GLUT5 transporter. Doesn't really matter what it's called, but essentially it doesn't require anything additional. It doesn't take any additional energy to move it. It just needs to bind to this transporter and out it goes. Glucose, on the other hand.
Out it goes into the bloodstream.
Right. Glucose is transported by SLGT1, which is a sodium-dependent transporter. What that means is that it relies on a sodium gradient. So if you remember kind of basic biology, things move across membranes often because of a concentration difference. So in order to move glucose, you need a different amount of salt on one side of the membrane than the other. So we have two transporter molecules. If you only had one, say you were only fueling with fructose, you're going to be limited in how fast you can absorb it by how many transporter molecules are available for fructose. Similarly, for glucose, you're limited by the number and also by the amount of salt that's available.
Does the body have like half and half, or what's like, is that dependent on the individual?
It is affected by what you train with. And this is, again, why kind of gut training and training with the fuel you plan to race with is important, because as you're supplying fuel to your body, it's going to figure out
what it
needs. And that's, I think, again, another reason to be really intentional about trying different things and then training with the thing that's working for you so that you can kind of optimize for that.
Well, and not to skip ahead here, but I think an important element of what we're talking about here is that by having a fuel source, i.e. a gel of some kind that has multiple types of sugar between fructose and glucose, that allows then for these processes to occur in parallel.
Correct. Yeah. So now we're moving things twice as fast as we would if it was only one type of sugar.
Right. And yes, maybe if you only had the one type, then you'd have more of those things. But I still think.
Yeah, it seems to be rate capped in every study I read at about 1 gram per minute.
Oh, yeah, I think I did see that.
Parallel, you can get to like 1.8. So it's not quite double, but you're doing way better than a single.
Interesting.
And again, for glucose, you're going to need some salt available also. And that's also why sometimes when you get dehydrated, it can also feel like you're having a hard time taking fuel at that point. So all of these things, what we're kind of setting up here is types of sugar and amount of salt are kind of the 3 key players, in addition to presence of water in it being able to absorb your fuel and absorb it at a rate that is optimized. So the 1 gram per minute works out to 60 grams an hour, which coincidentally, I think most of the time, if you look at modern recommendations for how much fuel you need to be taking for something intense, you're going to see 30 grams to 60 grams an hour, because 60 really is the cap for most athletes, unless you're going to aggressively train to do more.
So we know we have these 2 different types. We know that that's important. Presumably then nutrition companies know about this and they have thought about their formulations.
You hope so.
So
we have a spreadsheet that we will make available that does make me question how much some of the companies have thought about it. But
so what are some of the trends that we've seen in nutritional products? Are there common ratios of glucose to fructose? And how does that translate into literally what's on the shelf?
Product on the shelf.
Yeah.
Sure. So if you look at the back of a gel product, you're typically either going to see, in this order, glucose and then fructose, or you will see maltodextrin and then fructose. And maltodextrin is basically just a complex polymer that very quickly breaks down into glucose. So if you see maltodextrin, it's glucose by the time it gets where it's going. The typical ratio.
Is there a reason why maltodextrin has become this?
I think it just breaks down very quickly and it's stable in its form. So it's probably an easy one to formulate. You can buy it. I have a jar of it in our cupboard of fuel.
What?
I do.
What do you use it for?
I slip it into your smoothies and ultras.
I'm flabbergasted. You just slipping in maltodextrin?
I am.
Okay, is this street legal?
I assume so.
Of course. Yeah. Okay. All right.
Yeah. So maltodextrin and fructose are going to be the main ingredients. I would say, let's call it kind of the classic gel. Those are going to be a 2-to-1 ratio for most. I believe the 2-to-1, and I haven't really seen anything that directly addresses this, but, because we know that the transporters seem to be roughly even. However, fructose is more highly correlated with GI distress. And I think particularly in women. So I think that's where the 2-to-1 ratio comes from. You have twice as much glucose to fructose. And I think that is just to make it sort of a more easily digestible product.
And remind me, which of the 2 requires a bit of salt?
So that is the glucose.
Okay. So glucose requires a bit of salt. Fructose does not. You would think that that would mean if you have fewer ingredients to make the recipe, that would be better, but it may not be, because it could cause, or tends to be associated with higher GI distress.
Correct. So yeah, so the 2-to-1 products,
but they would still be included because it's this like in parallel processing of sugar from a performance perspective.
And I believe fructose is more quickly absorbed by the liver. So in terms of getting fuel to the liver, which can then redistribute it, it is efficient for that. So I think that's why, it's still in there. It's still needed. But I believe in a traditional gel. That's my thinking anyway on why the 2-to-1 has kind of been where we've landed. And the vast majority of traditional gels, that is the formulation.
So what are examples of 2-to-1?
Yeah. So Precision, Huma, Goo, Carbs, Scratch, the hydration product, all of those are 2-to-1. And in fact, if you look up their nutrition information, they usually will state that. Some even say it on the label. But I think if you're just in the running shop and you're looking at products, you at least want to see either maltodextrin or glucose listed ahead of fructose if that's the type of product that you're looking for.
So what falls outside of that then? Because there's a ton of products that you didn't just mention.
Right.
So I suspect you're going to tell me that there's another sort of common ratio.
Right. So that would be 1 to 0.8. So we still have more glucose than fructose, but they're a lot closer in ratio. So that increases absorption because remember, if we're kind of even on our transporters, then one is not becoming a roadblock. So you're optimizing for absorption in that case. And those products, so those are things that are suitable. If you hear of athletes going up to 90 grams per hour, it's going to be one of those 1 to 0.8 formulations typically. So those are things like Morton, Science and Sport. Interestingly, Honey Stinger falls into that category.
I would not have thought that.
I think it's just because that's what honey is.
And the reason why I would not have thought that is because you've got fructose that can cause higher GI distress. I feel like a lot of people cite Honey Stinger as this super easy thing to get down. And I also think you hear that about Science and Sport because it's much more of a liquid than it is
and we'll get to why
sort of concentrated. Yeah, so it's a curious observation that you've got these products that are trying to push the rate limit on getting as much sugar into you as possible. But it's worth knowing for the listener that if you are a person who has tried Morton, Science and Sport, Honey Stinger, that if you've said, yeah, this doesn't sit well with my stomach, there's a very plausible reason as to why. But that then switching from Morton to Science and Sport
might not be the answer.
Is probably not the answer.
Yeah. And I think for Honey Stinger in particular, and this was also, I think Untapped is also a similar like 1-to-1 kind of ratio. And this is true when I was kind of going through my survey of products. I think things that are more natural, like honey itself, just honey off the shelf, is essentially 1-to-1. That's just what honey is. And same with maple syrup.
Right.
So when you're getting a less processed product, you're also getting something that is potentially less optimized. So that's something to keep in mind. I think.
And when you say 1 to 0.8, is that an average or is that actually pretty consistent in terms of what they are using?
The published for many of these. If you look it up, it will absolutely say 1 to 0.8 specifically. And the last one to bring up in that category is like a Scratch super high carb hydration is also a 1 to 0.8. And then there's kind of some outliers that I think are worth mentioning. Hammer is 80% maltodextrin, which is glucose. So 80% we're clearly way over 1 to 2 or even 1-to-1 at that point. We are pretty all in on just being glucose. And then it's 20 other kinds of dextrins. And they don't say
20% other kinds, not 20 other kinds.
Yeah. 20% of mystery dextrins, at least based on what they publish. So again, I think if you've tried Hammer and you find that it's not, maybe you feel like you're getting sloshy or you're just not absorbing it, it could be because it's basically a single path product. UCAN, which is a really long cornstarch molecule, essentially, is another sort of single sugar version. And a fun fact is I found a study that showed that lactose, which was among our other simple sugars, is, provided you are not lactose intolerant, is a perfectly viable fuel choice. So milk may not have been a terrible idea.
You don't hear that often. Okay, so we have our 2-to-1 ratio products, our 1-to-0.8 ratio products. There's a couple of outliers, but we also know that many of these products vary in terms of how thick or thinned they are. And the main reason might be, more water or less water in that. So can you go into a bit of, if we're talking about a quadrant here of how we would put products? I feel like we've put ratio on one of those sides. Yeah. What's on the other side of our quadrant?
Yeah. So then the other main difference you're going to find if you're looking at the shelf of products is isotonic versus hypertonic. And isotonic products are formulated to be essentially at the same sugar and salt concentrations as your body or cellular fluid. What that means is you don't have to take them with additional water or additional salt in order to absorb them. So those products are, I think, the most commonly known are Science and Sport and More10.
I think, by the way, when I first started taking Science and Sport, and maybe I'm dumb, I'd hope I'm not, but when I first heard that, I was like, oh, so I don't have to take additional water on the day. So I don't know if anybody else resonates with, I think, misunderstanding that message.
Well, I think part of the development, and I could be wrong on the history here, but some of what I read in the science would suggest that they were kind of originally thought of as being optimal for shorter events. So you could just something where you might need carbohydrate, but you wouldn't necessarily
need a ton of water.
Pause for water. So I don't know if it was 10Ks or a fast half marathon, but they were sort of meant to be, and it also obviously optimizes absorption.
Yeah.
But that is typically why those products, it's usually a little bigger packet because it's literally watered down in order to make it absorbable without water. So you're basically getting the water in the gel.
Yeah.
Hypertonic fuel has a higher salt and sugar concentration than your body. So that is why if you actually read the back of a GU, not the part that says 1BQ, but the instructions, it will say take with water. That is because it needs to be diluted in order to be absorbed. So if you're somebody that's been taking GUs or taking Huma or any of these products and feeling like you swallow it and it just sits in your stomach, it might be that you're just not taking them with water and they can't really be processed and be absorbed because they are too concentrated. And what your body will do is pull water.
Yeah, I was just going to say,
pulls it
out of you in so that it can then
put it back.
Yeah.
So it's not that you're dehydrating, but it's also it's not optimal for absorption and it's not optimal for you.
Right.
And it also probably means you're dehydrated. So.
And it's slowing the rate at which your body is able to absorb the sugar that you're putting in.
So I think that's sort of a critical thing to understand when you're choosing a gel is, do I need to take this literally at the same time with water? Or, and if you are carrying a handheld and you are hydrated and there is water in your system, that doesn't mean that you need to double fist it, but.
Or you're about to hit a aid station, right? And it's let me get the gel in. We're not saying contemporaneous and instantaneous. We're just saying it should be within a couple of minutes, right?
Don't run 2 more miles.
Right.
Before you hit the water fountain or something,
right?
If you're on a long run. And I think, again, that's another thing to think about, is there water available on your route versus not? What are you carrying? Those kind of things all affect fueling as much as they affect, simple hydration.
Right.
And also, isotonic fuel only has, if you look at the nutrition facts on those products, the salt content is going to be relatively low compared to what you see on a more traditional hypertonic.
So this is what I was going to ask of, like, if our quadrant turned into like a cube, I feel like the next dimension would be high salt versus low salt. And why is it that we see isotonic products with a lower salt? And does that then also not mean then that you're just going to have to consume that elsewhere?
Yeah. I mean, it's basically...
Which I think, to your point, is why it probably was better for shorter distances, because it meant that you were taking all that you needed for a shorter distance for which carbs would still be beneficial. But in a world where you need carbs, water, and salt,
which is any longer event.
Right, which is any longer event, especially a marathon. Yeah. Then you're going to need to, like, none of these things can be by themselves.
Yeah.
And need to be part of a system if they're going to work for you and you're not going to be missing out on something major, right? So it's like, it sounds like, if we're taking a step back, that some of the more concentrated items on the shelf, like Huma, for example, I think has your carbs and your salt.
Right.
But you're going to still need...
It's just add water.
It's just add water, right. There are others in that same 2-to-1 bucket, like Precision, that are very low in sodium.
Yeah.
So
Zero.
I'm sorry?
0 in the case of Precision.
Yeah. And therefore your hydration needs to include...
Yeah, that's like a bring your own
sodium.
Salt product.
Right. And then you have like these isotonic where you kind of need both.
It's not going to hydrate you.
Yeah.
It's just providing enough to kind of take care of itself in terms of absorption.
Right.
That's a good way to encapsulate these buckets. There is no all-in-one product.
Right.
And so when you're selecting a fuel, it's worth thinking about what it is that it's like the pairing that then becomes important to make sure that you're not only supplying carbs, you're supplying enough electrolytes and you're getting hydrated.
Which I think, is almost frustrating when you think of the fact that often, and I think major marathons and ones that are sponsored by something like Gatorade, hopefully they're not watering them down. Yeah. But if that is how you are ensuring that you're getting enough salt, because you've got your gels, but you're not carrying a bottle, right? And we know certain major marathons, whether that's Tokyo, I don't even think they allow you to bring anything, which means that you're dependent on whatever it is that they provide. Your nutritional selections very much matter when you're thinking about, am I getting carbs, salt, and water, and in what sort of general mix and concentration?
Right. So I think it's then worth talking about...
Which brings me back, by the way, to... Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Just that, which brings me back to one of my forays into trying science and sport. And I remember doing a marathon basically exclusively on science and sport.
Did you drink anything?
I think I did, but there's basically no sodium.
If you were drinking water, you weren't...
I was drinking water. And again, this is not a science and sport is bad.
Yeah.
It's just that I was not consciously thinking of and aware of, I also need to get salt. I just kind of had that message of well,
I think the natural assumption is I'm buying this thing that says it's for running and it's a fuel product, and I'm going to assume that this has everything I need.
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily the case.
Right. Well, and it could be also where, as an athlete, we need to think of, I often have two different types of...
And I think that's common.
Right. And probably where we'll get to here
because of flavor fatigue or whatever else. You're going to alternate, or you're somebody that wants to use choose, which is like a whole other set of criteria. Generally, those aren't necessarily in one of these perfect ratios. Some are, but not everything.
But having solely and exclusively one of these products without consciously thinking about what it is missing is probably the best advice that we might be able to give coming out of this. I know a lot of athletes that they only do one of the products that we're mentioning.
Yeah. And as long as you're counterbalancing that with what is missing, then
that's totally fine. Yeah. But many, I suspect, are not.
Yeah.
And hopefully this episode will help.
Yeah. So let's get down to the nitty gritty of how much you need, because I think that's, then once we understand that, we can start building out, am I checking my boxes? So the current recommendations are 30 grams per hour, 30 grams of carbohydrates, to be specific, for events that are 1 to 2 hours long, 60 grams per hour for events.
And presumably that's lower because if you're in 1 to 2 hours, you're really just supplementing that which you already have. Yeah. Let's assume that you're not entering this like totally depleted.
Yeah. And there is benefit even in something that is in the, 1 to 2 hour bucket, even if you could do that entirely on your own stores. Right. Just as we know, like the fact that your brain is getting the signal that fuel is coming, all of that will still enhance performance.
Oh, yeah. I mean, even for half marathons, I would always at least do 2 gels of some kind, even if I'm finishing like an hour 20, or under that. And I think it gave me the license to not worry about it, but I definitely still took one before and maybe one at mile 7.
I mean, and it also enhances recovery because you're not totally depleting your muscles. I mean, I think a great example of this is like Breaking 2. Mm-hmm. It's a 2-hour race. In theory, he could do that on his carb-loaded stores, but they still very much fueled that effort. Yeah. So 30 grams per hour for events that are 1 to 2 hours long, 60 grams per hour for events that are 2 to 3 hours, and then up to 90 grams per hour for events longer than 3 hours. 90 is going to take some work for most people.
And you're really only going to get that if you're either heavily working, or do you think that that's going to be a little bit easier to hit in the 1 to 0.8 ratio
so
products?
That's really where those products
because you're maxing out the rate limiting.
Those are optimized for absorption and not necessarily for like ease of consumption.
Right.
So that's really where you need to be going to something that is probably like a 1 to 0.8. Ratio as opposed to
or you just need to like coming back to gut training. I think we're going to get into this section in a second of for those 2 to 1 products, you just need to train to be able to take more of them.
Yeah.
Right. On the higher end of the, like, how often are you taking?
Yeah. But we know that still kind of maxes out at some point.
Sure.
So it will take effort.
Right.
So for context, most gels are going to be 25 to 30 grams of carbohydrates. And I think the other sort of helpful thing to remember is a gram of carbohydrates is 4 calories. So that's about, a gel, if it's 25 grams, is going to be 100 calories. So we've talked about rates of carbohydrate. The other thing we need to keep in mind, of course, is the amount of salt that you need. This is something that varies widely. Depending on the athlete, and sweat rates can be like, the normal range is like 1x to 10x. Mm-hmm. So that's something that you kind of need to pay attention to. And I think if you're somebody that really craves salt after a long run, then you're probably losing more salt and sweat. But the general recommendation is 300 to 600 milligrams per hour. So I think for most people
of sodium.
So I think if you haven't really dialed it in, start in that range and then see if you're still craving salty French fries after your run, then maybe you need to be at the higher end or go above that.
Right. And we're trying not to make this complicated, we promise. But in our cube of like, you've got 2 to 1, 1 to 1, which for most people, I think you don't really need to worry about that much other than just to understand that if it's a 1 to point, sorry, I'm going to say 1 to 1, I really mean 1 to 0.8. But if it's a 1 to 0.8 product, that it means that it's higher in fructose, which means that it is a higher likelihood of upsetting your GI. And that while it is attempting to maximize your absorption rate, that might come at the cost of GI, which of course, which is kind of counterintuitive for a Morton, given that they're all about like,
Well, yeah. And I think we'll get into this when we talk about kind of GI issues, but I think there's a number of things that can cause GI distress. One can be you're not absorbing. Another can be gastric emptying being a problem.
Which if you're talking about the 2 to 1 products, which tend to be the ones that are more concentrated and hypertonic, means that like that I think will also cause GI distress if you're not consuming it with water.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's where I'm kind of getting into like the troubleshooting and just assuming like gels don't work for me.
Right.
They might not be working for a number of reasons.
Right. And that may not, and some of those might be within your control, and maybe some of them are not. But if you took a Precision or a Huma or a GU and regularly did not accompany that with water within a reasonable time frame, then probably is going to upset your stomach. And so, like, is that the fault of the thing, or is that the fault of respectfully not following instructions?
If you need to be getting, let's say, 60 grams of carbs per hour and 300 to 600 milligrams of salt per hour, and you need to accomplish that with some combination of gels and liquids, I think if you kind of want I don't want to think about this, just tell me something that works. You can choose a traditional like 2-to-1 gel product, which was any of the things that we, listed, like GU or Huma or those kind of sort of your basic gel. Those all are coming with somewhere between 1 to 250 milligrams of salt in a gel. With each gel, you're going to get about 25 to 30 grams of carbohydrates, and you're going to get 1 to 300 milligrams of salt. So,
and if you took 2 to 3 of them on average, 2 to 3
in an hour,
your bases are covered. Plus water.
Just need water.
Right. I think that's the easiest sort of upshot of all of this is like the 2-to-1 products will probably be fine for most, provided you take it with water and you take 2 to 3 of them, which kind of makes sense when they say take every 20 to 30 minutes, because that is 2 to 3.
If you are more, if you're trying to hit higher than 60 grams per hour, or you feel like absorption is your issue and not something else in terms of, GI upset, then you could go to the sort of 1-to-1 products. You're just going to need to do that with a beverage that's going to cover your 300 to 600 milligrams of salt per hour. So you're then separating, which for some people actually might be preferred if you can just separate, this is my carb product, this is where I'm getting my salt. And you can either do that with something like Noon, where the tablet doesn't really have any sugar. So you're relying completely on your gels for sugar. You're relying on the tablet for salt, or you could be doing it with salt tabs and water. So you're just kind of separating those two, and you can dial them up or down independently.
You just have to make sure that if you're in race, that you're able to get access to the kind of salinity in your beverage.
So like for New York Marathon, the on-course nutrition is Morton, which we know then requires additional salt for your hydration purposes. Gatorade Endurance is the beverage on the course, and that is actually pretty high in salt, provided they are mixing it to the correct ratio, but that's kind of always a question. And some races even intentionally mix it at half strength.
A lot of people like, and we haven't spent a great deal of time on chews, but a lot of people like real food, gummy bears, Rice Krispie treats, Swedish fish, bananas. So these are all things that either people like to, take from an aid station on a, whether it's a club provided one or whatever, they're usually not at the race provided ones, or they're in your pocket. So how does that layer into this?
You can definitely use real food for race fuel. The onus then sort of falls to you, though, on this is not a product that's been designed for this purpose. So you're not going to be able to look up what the fructose to glucose ratio is of your gummy bear. Bananas actually conveniently, I did look this up, are about 2-to-1. Which, probably is why they are such a sort of naturally preferred fuel.
Why is Coke so good? And to be clear, Coca-Cola.
Yes. I mean, Coke is all fructose. I do think, I would suspect, and this is entirely me, speculating. The reason it is so good in an ultra, especially when you can't get anything else down, is probably because fructose does not require anything else. It just has its transporter molecule and it gets absorbed. So you don't,
Fast acting.
even if you have completely, you're dehydrated, you are low on electrolytes, it is a fuel that will just absorb and it will go to your liver and your liver will redistribute that sugar and, plus it's got caffeine. So my suspicion is that is why it often works when a traditional fuel product wouldn't. And that doesn't mean that it might not, if you don't tolerate fructose well, then that's not a great choice. But I think that is probably why it's often easier to take than a gel or, a hydration beverage at those points in a race.
So let's transition to carb loading, right? We're talking now, I think hopefully we've given everybody a sense that training with this stuff during your training cycle and training your gut is important. I think we have a few more points to make about gut training in a second, but doing that during the race, I just had my workout this past weekend, and even though I didn't need 3 full gels during the 8 miles that I was running, it was important to me that I was consuming while I was at pace. And so I really wanted to make sure that
was the race pace portion of your workout.
That was the race pace portion of my workout.
Being able to take it at pace is also
very important. Yeah. Because it's very different if I'm just like on a 20, 22 mile easy paced long run taking nutrition versus I'm at 6 minute mile and I'm trying to I'm breathing heavy and I'm
to get the thing
trying to get it down. Right. Which I think logistically is also an important point of, I know I definitely put my caffeinated ones are here, or I put my precision ones up front and then I put maybe Humas in the back, or I put, precision on one side and Huma on the right side. So there's different ways of doing it, but I try and do that at least a few times during my training cycle. But let's talk about carb loading. I know we approach it as a multi-day process. That one time that I approached it as a 1-day, 24-hour process was bad news bears. And I know I've heard that if you kind of reduce volume, that it's still a bit of carb loading if you kind of maintain. But
yeah, this is like carb loafing.
Right. So if you can talk a bit about that and what the literature says, or at least what we can infer from the literature on how to appropriately carb load, I think that'd be a good place to start for this section.
So I think for one thing, carb loading, truly loading and trying to maximize those stores is not a casual thing. It's not just eating a bowl of pasta the night before. It's actually quite a lot of carbs if you're going to max it out. So the recommendations for men are 9 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight. So for a 150-pound man, that's 600 grams of carbohydrate that you need to do for a day of carb loading. For context, a large bagel is 50 or 60 grams. So we're talking about 10 bagels worth. Sounds like a funny character, Mr. Bagelsworth.
Well, and when carbohydrates get stored, they also get stored with water. And so you're also going to feel,
so you're going to be carrying some extra weight. So that's something to think about. Also not to freak out about.
Right. If you've carb loaded correctly, you
will be a couple of
you will be
heavier.
Both heavier, you will feel heavier and actually be heavier.
Yeah, but it's also important to remember that water gets released as the carbohydrate is burned. So by the end of the race, when you've burned through your carbs, that water has also, it's not useless weight.
Right.
It is in fact functional weight, and you will lose it in the course of the race.
Yeah. And will aid you in your hydration too, effectively.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's, 600 grams of carbs is no joke.
No.
For women, it's probably a more nuanced approach. And to get into the science a little bit, for men, you can just replace calories that were going to come from fat or protein with carbohydrates. So you're still keeping your overall caloric intake the same. You're just tipping it heavily towards carbs for those days. For women, that actually doesn't seem to enhance performance, interestingly. So a couple of studies I found showed that the only way that it really improved performance, you still are loading and your muscle glycogen increases, but it doesn't seem to translate to better performance unless you actually also increase total calories by 30%. So for men, you're trying to do your whatever, let's call it 600 grams a day. That means for men, you can just replace the 2,400 calories that represents from other parts of your diet.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe that means that almost all of your calories that day are coming from carbohydrates, but you don't need to increase your caloric intake overall. You can just swap them out.
Got it.
For women, just swapping them out and replacing 75% of your total calories with carbohydrates did improve carb contents of muscles, but it didn't improve performance. In order to improve performance, they also needed to up their total calories.
And is there a reason as to why we think that's the case?
There was not in either of the studies that I read. They didn't really speculate. For women, there also are some considerations depending on which part of your cycle you're in as to how much you can absorb. Maybe it's just a case of women's systems are a little more complicated. I would also wonder maybe if it's just that maybe upping the calories is actually getting you, if you were under fueling, maybe we're just now compensating for that. But yeah, for women, it seems like you actually do need to eat a little bit extra in addition to just switching to way more carbs for those days. But the recommendations for women are about 8.4 grams per kilogram. So if you're a 120-pound woman, that's 450 grams per day. So lower target, slightly lower grams per kilogram than for men, but you're probably going to have to overcompensate a little bit for that. So this is part of the reason, because those are big numbers of carbs, why we say, don't try to do this the day before. The day before. Race.
Yeah. Don't be like Matt Vosberg before Philadelphia Marathon 2023.
I think that's right.
That was terrible.
Yes.
I think what also made that terrible was that I thought that if I had a shit ton of ice cream the night before, lot of it was ice cream. But you just told me that lactose and milk may not be a bad choice. Yeah. I think it was the ice cream plus the pasta plus
pizza.
I think actually I did have pizza. Plus I might have had mashed potatoes too. That sounds like a me move.
Yeah.
Oh, you know what? I also had a naked juice.
Yes.
Maybe even two of them.
Yeah, which I actually think is a good idea.
Which is a good strategy. But I think I just threw everything.
You did everything.
In one day, and my body kind of
freaked
just
out.
I think because it was a GI issue.
Yeah.
I had to go to the bathroom during the race twice.
Yeah.
And it was not good.
So the good news is you don't have to do that. The best strategy seems to be super compensating glycogen loading by let's say you're doing a 1 week taper or a 2 week taper, it doesn't matter. But in the last week of your taper, you're probably going to do your last workout for a Sunday, Saturday race on Tuesday, maybe. So directly after a workout, your muscles are going to be the most depleted. If you kind of start your carb loading then, your muscles are kind of like sponges, and it's going to, where the highest demand is where most of the carbs are going to go. And remembering that we kind of need the carbs to be stored in the muscles that are going to be working. Start the loading immediately after your last hard workout. That's going to kind of draw the carbs where you want them. And you can load for 1 to 3 days, and as long as you're not doing workouts that will then deplete it, the muscle stores will remain high for 3 more days. So you could finish your carb loading Wednesday, have Thursday, Friday, Saturday, race on Sunday, and you're still loaded. That doesn't mean you don't need to replace liver glycogen, but in terms of your muscle stores, 3 days later, you're still fine as long as you haven't gone out and run hard.
Yeah.
So again, like we can take this as a multi-day strategy. You don't have to cram it all in on one day. And I would encourage people not to. And specifically, you know, to do it so that you're done carb loading before the day before the race. So race day eve, you just eat normally. Like do your normal, like pre-long run meal or, you know, something that's lighter and...
Yes, can attest. Yes. Don't go too much the day before. 2 days before. Well, it's almost like the same way with like sleep.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, it's like the sleep the night before the night before.
Yeah.
But to kind of get this to brass tacks in terms of, you know, options. So we talked about a bagel is 50 to 60 grams. A bowl of pasta is 40 to 50. So neither of those are actually the greatest sources, and certainly come with a lot of volume if you're trying to actually get to 600 grams, say, or 500.
But that's 500 to 600 over the course of a couple of days, not per day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's, I think in general, like leading up to the race, you don't want to be like feeling super full all the time. So that's why I tend to try to steer athletes to also think about liquid forms. I think those, you know, they go down easy. You're also hydrating. It's easy if you're traveling. Also, you're not, you know, if you're not relying on, I need to find a restaurant that has whatever. So like Morton 320 is 80 grams. 20 ounce Coke is 65 grams. And Naked Juice, I think those are also, I want to say like 40. So those are all ways to get carbs while not, you know, kind of having the bulk of a bagel or, you know, I think that often what happens when people try to carb load is they say I'm full. And that ends up being the limiting factor is I physically can't eat this much, which is perfectly reasonable. But if you do it with liquid calories, it's a good alternative. It also helps cover your hydration needs. And you can, you know, you can always add a Coke to a meal or orange juice or something like that.
Yeah. I wish I had this conversation with me a couple of years ago, but I think what we hope people have taken from this is carbs are important and there are a lot of products out there and different products are formulated in very different ways. And there are different levers that each brand is relying on. And for somebody trying to understand that at very high level terms will help you identify, particularly if you've seen a pattern of what does or doesn't work for you, or at least a reminder of what you need to think about when you take a certain type of nutritional product for your race or training needs, will hopefully help you with, I mean, ultimately all of this is about better performance. So as we close this out, are there any final things that you think are worth ensuring that the listener knows?
Well, I hope that this has kind of elucidated the various things that different products are optimized for. So if you are somebody that has struggled with nutrition in run, hopefully we've given you some ideas about what could be the problem or what problem you're trying to solve. And I think the only thing maybe that we haven't really talked about is people for whom the texture of the product or the taste of the product is actually the problem. So I know that there are people that just like a gel is not going to work just because they don't like the texture. There are chews, there are other things in that case that, you know, might be more optimal. So that I think that is a limiting factor we forget about, or it might be that you have gravitated to honey stinger or something because it is more natural and you like honey and it's therefore much easier to get down. So if that's the problem, the fact that it's a 1-to-1 or it's, you know, not optimal in some other way and doesn't have salt in it is something that you can fix with adding a different product to it. If you're somebody who just gets an incredibly sloshy stomach and in fact you've just been taking, you know, I think there's often a thing where people gravitate to water specifically if things aren't sitting well, because they think I need something, I don't want to add to this mix. But sometimes the problem is that you're low on salt and you're therefore not absorbing anything, which is why it's just sloshing around in your stomach. And then maybe you need to be thinking about isotonic products that are going to absorb quickly, if like gastric emptying is kind of the limiting factor, but just make sure that you're providing additional salt. So I just want people to realize there's not
a single
source of problem, and therefore there's not a single fix that's going to work. And usually not fueling is not the fix.
Right. And I think once you've eliminated products that you don't like based on taste, if there's a product that you're not averse to taste-wise but didn't work, I think it's worth exploring why it might not have worked before saying this definitely doesn't work for me.
Yeah.
Right. But I think totally understandable that like texture and taste are super important. And sure, that will eliminate things having nothing to do with whether they would theoretically help you perform.
Yeah.
They're not going to help you perform if you don't want to take them.
And then probably the last one is there are now things like Scratch High Carb and some other products in that space where those are 400 calories in a bottle. So if you're somebody that just can't do gels or anything solid, you can totally fuel your race. As long as you can refill that bottle, you can fuel a race on that. And
refuel it at the time that you need it to be. Yeah.
But there are options. I think there are at least more options now than ever, and probably a solution to whatever the problem is if you're willing to work at it and train with it and think through the issues.
Yeah. This will by no means be the last discussion that we have on things like nutrition, and, the science changes. And so I'm sure in a few months or in a year from now, we'll need to redo this as more information comes out about how our bodies process these things, or additional products and breakthroughs in nutritional products.
Oh, and we do have the fuel selector spreadsheet that we will make available, which I just kind of put together in the course of research to get this straight in my head. So that basically you can sort fuels by ratio, by amount of salt, by isotonic, hypertonic, and we have separate tabs for gels, for solid food, and for hydration products.
Yeah. So it's been a great conversation. And I appreciate you sharing all of and doing so much research that has gone into this discussion. I mean, we talk about it a lot with our athletes, and it's such a complicated, it feels like a complicated landscape, and there is a way to think through these in a way that's methodical. And hopefully we've done that today.